Hello, thanks for watching the Calvary Briefing. It's August 27th, 2020. I so appreciate you watching each time we send one of these out. I wanted to share with you something that really impacted me last week as I was reading through my Old Testament. And a word popped up, and the word is located in Numbers chapter 20 and a couple of other places in the Bible, but the word is MERIBAH. And the word represents something that happened in the history of Israel. And I wanted to read for you the verses that really impacted me last week. Numbers chapter 20, verses 2 through 13. And the people of Israel, the whole congregation, came into the wilderness of Zin in the first month, and the people stayed in Kadesh. And Miriam died there and was buried there. Now there was no water for the congregation, and they assembled themselves together against Moses and against Aaron. And the people quarreled with Moses and said, "Would that we had perished when our brothers perished before the Lord. Why have you brought the assembly of the Lord into this wilderness that we should die here, both we and our cattle? And why have you made us come up out of Egypt and bring us to this evil place? It is no place for grain or figs or vines or pomegranates, and there's no water to drink." Then Moses and Aaron went from the presence of the assembly to the entrance of the tent of meeting, and they fell on their faces. And the glory of the Lord appeared to them, and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Take the staff and assemble the congregation, you and Aaron your brother, and tell the rock before their eyes to yield its water. So you shall bring water out of the rock for them and give drink to the congregation and their cattle." Moses took the staff from before the Lord as he commanded him. Then Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock, and he said to them, "Hear now, you rebels, shall we bring water for you out of this rock?" And Moses lifted up his hand and struck the rock with his staff twice, and water came out abundantly, and the congregation drank, and their livestock. And the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Because you did not believe me, to uphold me as holy in the eyes of the people of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land that I've given them. These are the waters of MERIBAH, where the people of Israel quarreled with the Lord, and through them he showed himself holy." These verses in this episode in the history of the nation of Israel showed me something. They showed me grumbling and complaining and all of the situations that can come out of grumbling and complaining. And one question might come to mind, well, how serious really is grumbling and complaining? Well, it's serious enough in God's eyes that an entire generation of people from the nation of Israel were prohibited from entering the promised land. Grumbling and complaining are serious enough that Aaron and Moses were impacted by this grumbling and complaining and disobeyed God, and they were prohibited from entering the promised land. I did a little experiment. I decided I would Google a question. And Google, as you may know, is not a religious search engine. But I Googled this question anyway. What does the Bible teach about grumbling and complaining? I typed that into Google, and boom, all kinds of replies came up. I hit the very first reply, and it had a list of verses about what the Bible teaches about grumbling and complaining. Any idea how many verses there are? And I don't think this was all of the verses, but any idea how many verses may have been there? I won't keep you in suspense. There were 105. 105. 105 verses in the Bible that speak about grumbling and complaining and about not doing it. I think that there are probably some key verses that might come to your mind, but at least a couple of the passages that impacted me were Philippians 2, verses 12 through 16. Paul is in prison, as he writes to the Philippians, chained up between two guards probably. And he writes, "Therefore, my beloved, as you've always obeyed, so now, not only as in my presence, but much more in my absence, work out your salvation with fear and trembling. For it is God who works in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure. Do all things without grumbling or complaining, that you may be blameless and innocent children of God, without blemish, in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world, holding fast to the word of life, so that in the day of Christ I may be proud that I did not run in vain or labor in vain." Did you catch Paul's words? Do all things without grumbling or questioning or complaining. And as we do all things without grumbling and questioning and complaining, we shine as lights in a twisted and crooked generation. Boy, as I look at our world today, twisted and crooked is a pretty good definition. And this twisted and crooked world could use some light. James 5:9 is another verse that came in this Google search. "Do not grumble against one another, brothers, so that you may not be judged. Behold, the judge is standing at the door." It's really tough to keep ourselves from grumbling and complaining. And I want you to know that as I speak to you today, I have noticed in myself that over these last months of the pandemic, grumbling and complaining has almost become second nature to me. It just happens naturally. I started to talk to someone close to me about my grumbling and complaining. And I sort of tried to build in some accountability and noticed that before an hour was up, I was already back at grumbling and complaining. It's just become second nature to us. There is so much different in our lives, and there's so much wrong in our lives that it's very difficult not to just jump into grumbling and complaining. So when I speak about MERIBAH, and as I was convicted in Numbers last week, it's because I fall into this, and I think you fall into this. I think it's very difficult for us as a church not to fall into this, grumbling and complaining. But one of the things that's really significant about sin in our lives is that oftentimes it's much easier to identify that sin than to actually stop sinning or to come up with some strategies to stop sinning. And so I wanted to also look at the issue of MERIBAH and say, well, if we don't want MERIBAH to be our experience, what should we do? And I just have a couple of suggestions that came to my mind and my heart. How can we prevent a MERIBAH mindset? How can we prevent grumbling and complaining in our lives? Well, as with most things in life, I would say, first of all, consider Jesus. Think about Jesus. In the book of Hebrews, we are reminded that we are surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses in chapter 12. and we're encouraged to run with endurance the race that's set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is now seated at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured from sinners such hostility against himself, so that you may not grow weary or faint-hearted. In your struggle against sin, you've not yet resisted to the point of shedding your blood. As we look at the book of Hebrews, and as we look to Jesus, is there anybody in the history of the world who had more of a reason to complain and grumble? As he was dying on the cross, he had friends that he had invested his life in who had turned their backs on him. He'd been a victim of the Roman government kangaroo court. And now he was dying naked, nailed to a cross in front of people who were jeering and spitting at him. And oh, by the way, the blood that was flowing from his body was covering their sin. If anybody had a reason to grumble or complain, it was Jesus. And he didn't. He didn't because of the joy set before him. He didn't because he had endurance in the race that he was given. I think we can look to Jesus and find inspiration and help in our struggle against grumbling and complaining. Hebrews goes on to tell us that the Lord disciplines the ones he loves and chastises every son whom he receives. You see, when we grumble and complain, we are basically grumbling and complaining against God. And he sends everything into our lives in order to mold us and to make us into the people he wants us to be. I have no idea how God is using some of the challenges that have come into all of our lives recently for his glory and our good, but it's all from his hand. And as Jesus accepted his road with joy and endurance, let's look to him. Secondly, and this is hard, we need to abide in Jesus. In John 15, we read the famous passage, I am the true vine, and my Father is the vine dresser. Every branch in me that does not bear fruit, he takes away, and every branch that does not bear fruit, he prunes, that it may bear more fruit. As the branch cannot bear fruit by itself unless it abides in the vine, neither can you unless you abide in me. I was reminded as I was working in the garden with my wife Debbie the other day, we took one particular vine and a branch was torn off of it and thrown onto the grass. And we did a few more things. And when I turned around just a few minutes later, that vine had already started to shrivel up. When it was disconnected from the branch, it couldn't survive at all. Abiding in Jesus is like that for the follower of Jesus. We need to realize that our survival is in him. And we need to stay connected to him. And John 15 goes on to tell us how we do that. Abide in my love. If you keep my commandments, you will abide in my love, just as I've kept my Father's commandments and abide in his love. Abiding in Jesus is walking through life with him, realizing that all of our life comes from him. We can't survive without him. That's humbling. But it also means taking what he says seriously. And as he commands us to do things, we do them. And we find joy in them. So we need to look to Jesus, fix our eyes on Jesus. We need to abide in Jesus. And finally, we need to put on our big boy pants or our big girl pants and just stop grumbling. When we have reasons to grumble, at least reasons in our own minds, we need to have a mindset that just says, just stop it. Just stop it. In the book of 1 Peter, chapter 1, Peter says, preparing your minds for action and being sober-minded, set your hope fully on the grace that will be brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. As obedient children, do not be conformed to the passions of your former ignorance, but as he who called you is holy, you also be holy in all your conduct, since it is written, you shall be holy, for I am holy. There are times in our lives when the reasoning of Scripture, when the logical conclusions of Scripture don't help us, and we simply have to gut it out and quit grumbling. So, as we look at MERIBAH, let's cross it out of our experience. Let's cross it out of our lives. And let's look to Jesus. Let's abide in Jesus. And let's just stop grumbling and complaining. And if we do that, in this twisted and crooked world, it will mean that we shine like lights. Calvary Church, I call you to move beyond the MERIBAH experience for the glory of God and the good of this world in which we live. Thanks for watching.